In 1994, my father retired and decided it was time for us to move to an isolated house in a small town in California. He always said he needed peace and quiet, far from the confusion and intrigues of the neighbors. Our new home was perfect for that. A large old house, surrounded by tall trees that created a sense of total isolation. My name is Tom, and at that time, I was 12 years old. My mother, Sarah, was a loving and dedicated woman who always did her best to keep the house in order. And my younger sister, Emily, at 8 years old, was the joy of the family. Soon after we settled in, my father had the brilliant idea of building a woodshed in the backyard. "It'll be a great project for us, Tom," he said with his usual enthusiasm. I didn't share the same feeling. Spending weekends digging holes, cutting wood, and putting up walls for a shed wasn't exactly my idea of fun. On the first day of construction, my father and I started early. He taught me how to measure and mark the land while I held the tape measure with a sigh of frustration. With every piece of wood we needed to saw, my hands hurt and my arms quickly tired. Meanwhile, Emily watched us from afar, occasionally bringing glasses of lemonade that my mother had prepared. Every time she smiled and said we were doing a great job, I felt a mix of pride and exhaustion. We spent weeks in this rhythm. My father, Henry, never lost his patience, even when I made mistakes with measurements or dropped tools. He always corrected me calmly, saying it was all part of the learning process. But for me, it felt like endless torture. I hated every second of the physical work, wishing I could be doing anything else. The hot Californian sun made the work even more exhausting, and many times I thought about giving up. But my father's determination was unwavering, and I didn't want to disappoint him. Over time, the walls of the shed began to take shape. Each board we put in place brought me a step closer to finishing that infernal project. Emily, always curious, asked questions about the construction, and my father answered patiently, as if it were a great family adventure. I, on the other hand, could only think about how much I hated that work. Finally, after many weeks of effort, the shed was almost complete. We felt a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction seeing the result of our work. Despite all the hatred I had for that project, there was something gratifying about seeing the shed standing in the backyard, knowing I had helped build it. On the night we finished the shed, I was exhausted, but there was a strange feeling of accomplishment in the air. As I walked back to the house, I saw something at the shed door. A tall, thin figure, about 6 feet tall, dressed in old, tattered clothes, almost translucent, was standing there. I blinked several times, thinking it was my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe I had summoned a spirit with all my effort, the outbursts of wanting to be anywhere else, and the desperate prayers for the work to end. I laughed at myself, imagining how an accidental ritual might have been performed. Let's see, how many milliliters of blood on the grass were there? 5, maybe 10, plus the prayers to all the saints I know, added to all the curses I muttered during construction. That must have been it, I thought, trying to lighten up. With a shiver down my spine, I shook my head, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. I felt a mix of relief and confusion, convincing myself that my mind was playing tricks on me because of the fatigue. I went inside, trying to shake off the disturbing image and convincing myself it was all an illusion. The night fell silent and heavy. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up abruptly, feeling a strange presence. I looked out the window, and there was the figure again, in front of the shed. My heart raced as I watched the creature start to float, moving in a supernatural way towards me. I felt a deep, paralyzing fear take hold of me. Before I could react, the entity appeared at the second-floor window, floating outside. Fear left me cold. The creature approached the window crack, and as if made of mist, slipped into the room. I was frozen with terror as it materialized before me. Its empty eyes seemed to pierce my soul. It approached, and with a voice that seemed to come from a nightmare, asked, "Is tonight a good night to die?" It extended its hand towards me, and I backed away, stumbling. In panic, I looked at Emily's bed. The entity slowly turned and began to float towards her, "No!" I shouted, but my voice came out as a desperate whisper. I ran down the hall, banging on my parents' door with all my strength, desperate for help. "Dad! Mum! Wake up!" I shouted, feeling the tears of terror streaming down my face. They opened the door, their expressions of concern quickly turning to alarm upon seeing my state. "What's happening, Tom?" my father asked, but I couldn't respond. I only pointed towards Emily's room. Running behind me, they entered Emily's room and found her unconscious on the bed. My mother let out a cry of despair while my father tried to revive her, without success. The entity had disappeared, leaving only a trail of terror. After the incident, my parents called the police. When the officers arrived, the house was enveloped in an oppressive silence, broken only by my mother's sobs. The police examined every corner, asking questions and taking pictures. Initially, they looked at me with a mix of suspicion and pity, as if they thought I might have done something to my sister. Although they didn't say it directly, I could see in their eyes and hear in their murmurs that there was distrust. The investigations were swift, but no less painful. The official cause of Emily's death was determined to be a heart attack. The official story told by the police was one of a home invasion. They claimed that someone broke into the house, entered our room, and upon seeing us, panicked. Emily, waking up and encountering the intruder, supposedly had a panic attack that culminated in a heart attack. It was hard to swallow. Has anyone ever seen an 8-year-old have a heart attack like that, out of nowhere? I tried to tell the truth about the creature that invaded our room, but no one gave me any credibility. To the police and the adults around me, it was easier to believe in a common invasion than in a supernatural entity. My father, Henry, tried to console me, saying everything would be all right and that maybe I had dreamed it. My mother, Sarah, could barely look at me. After the event, our family began to disintegrate. My mother fell into a deep depression, spending entire days without leaving Emily's room. She avoided my father, silently blaming him for what happened. The tension between them grew each day, with frequent arguments and long periods of heavy silence. Eventually, the pressure was too much, and they decided to separate. My mother couldn't accept what had happened, and my father, desperate to maintain some normalcy, ended up moving away. For me, the pain was overwhelming. I increasingly repressed the memories of that night, trying to forget the terror I felt. School also became a challenge. The other students knew about the tragedy and looked at me with a mix of morbid curiosity and fear. The teachers were kind, but the pity in their eyes only made me feel worse. I couldn't concentrate, lost in thoughts and memories I desperately tried to suppress. The nights were the worst. Sleeping alone in a room where I used to share space with my sister was terrifying. Every noise seemed amplified, and the darkness seemed to hide things I didn't want to see. Gradually, I began to forget. It was a natural defense, a way of surviving. But even though the memories became vague, the impact of those nights never completely disappeared. Years passed, and eventually, life moved on. Now an adult, I lived in a modest house in another city, trying to lead a normal life. Few people knew about the tragedy that had marked my childhood. At work, I was just another face in the crowd, efficient and discreet. Among friends, I maintained a mask of tranquility, trying to ignore the invisible scars I carried. The dark memories of that night began to hide in the shadows of my mind, emerging only as fragments in my deepest nightmares. However, small triggers still managed to bring back repressed memories. The sound of soft footsteps in the hallway, a cold breeze passing through a half-open window, or even the laughter of a child in the distance. Each of these sounds transported me back to that isolated house, to the room I shared with Emily, and to the terrifying figure that invaded our lives. One night, after a particularly exhausting day at work, I came home and collapsed on the couch. The TV was on, broadcasting some program I wasn't paying attention to. As the images flickered on the screen, my eyes began to close. I fell asleep right there, feeling the fatigue take over me. Suddenly, I was awakened by a peculiar sound. It was a whisper, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. I opened my eyes, and the room was plunged into an unsettling darkness, illuminated only by the faint light of the television. The sound repeated, a ghostly murmur that made me shiver. I looked around, trying to locate the source of the noise, but there was no one there. Slowly, the memories began to return, like a black tide invading my mind. I remembered the tall, thin figure, the empty eyes, and the voice that asked if it was a good night to die. My heart began to beat faster, and a chill ran down my spine. The images of the entity, and of Emily, lifeless on the bed, surfaced with painful clarity. The living room around me seemed to transform, the shadows lengthening and distorting, taking on familiar and terrifying shapes. It was as if I was back in that night, reliving the terror. The sound of soft footsteps in the hallway echoed in my ears, each beat reminding me of the moments that preceded the tragedy. I sat on the couch, trying to push away the memories, but they were relentless. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, struggling to calm down. But when I opened them again, the sight of a shadow at the door froze me. It was the same silhouette I had seen so many years ago, tall and thin, with indistinct contours. I blinked several times, and the shadow disappeared, leaving me alone in the darkness. I headed towards my bedroom but paused to look outside through the window. What I saw made my heart stop for a moment. There was the figure, exactly as I remembered it, tall and thin, with those empty, deep eyes. My whole body shuddered, and for an instant, I felt like I had gone back in time, reliving that terrible episode when I was 12 years old. The figure began to move towards me, floating silently across the yard. Every step it took seemed to echo in my mind, bringing back memories I had buried long ago. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a cruel trick of my disturbed mind, but everything seemed so real, so palpable. When the figure reached the window, it didn't hesitate. It passed through the glass as if there were no barrier, entering my room. Its presence was suffocating, and I felt paralyzed, unable to move or scream. The entity approached, and with that icy, haunting voice, spoke the same phrase that had tormented me since childhood. "Is tonight a good night to die?" It extended its hand towards me, and I backed away, the fear growing inside me. My heart was pounding uncontrollably, and every fiber of my being screamed for me to run. But my legs didn't respond. My feet felt glued to the floor. The entity came closer and closer, its hand almost touching me. Then, in the blink of an eye, I woke up. I was in my bed, the morning sun streaming through the cracks in the curtain. The clock read 7 o'clock. I sat up, still panting and with my heart racing. The room was silent. Nothing of the entity, nothing of the terror I had felt moments before. I wondered if it had all been a nightmare, a creation of a disturbed mind still bearing the weight of the trauma. But the sensation was so vivid, so real. Every detail, every word, everything was etched in my memory as if it had truly happened. I sat there on the bed, trying to discern between reality and imagination, not knowing if the entity had really returned or if it was just another fragment of my own inner demons.